My name is Angelina David. I'm the co-curator and moderator of today's meeting. This is the first meeting in a framework of a cycle of lectures about the city and the environment. It's called Changing City in a Changing Climate. Dear friends, for the solemn opening of the cycle of discussions, it's a long annual project, year-long project. Please, I would like to invite Miriam Budenbender. She is the referent in charge of environmental protection in the Consulate of Germany in Moscow. Dear colleagues, good evening, dear friends. I'm very happy to see all of you. Lots of familiar faces from different countries. Therefore, it's a great joy to be with you. By all means, I want to thank you and also thank the hosts for making this thing happen, putting it together. I believe that the city and the climate are probably the most important subjects today. On the one hand, it's awfully complicated to understand what's happening here. We're just looking at the city and it seems complex. When we also see how the climate and the city interact, that's almost impossible to encompass. But it's exceptionally exciting, interesting, and by all means, very necessary. When we observe what's happening, we do understand that we have no choice. We need to be in charge of these issues because we do realize that the process of urbanization will very soon go further and further. As far as I have seen, by 2030, there will be about 60% people globally living in cities. At the moment in Russia, that is 75% of the population already, which is quite a lot. And in the meantime, of course, urbanization and the cities are the lighthouses of economic growth. We do understand that life is happening in the cities today. And the more life is happening in the cities, the more challenges we'll be facing regarding residences, infrastructure. And we would need to do something about that. And the question is, what will that infrastructure and what those residences will be like? How will they be organized and built? We need to be talking about that. We need to be discussing that because the things are happening regarding climate change in general is horrifically accelerating, especially in the cities. We are facing a number of minor examples, like in Moscow this year. We have registered new record high temperature in the 50 years of observation. And if we talk about the sixth report of the IPCC, it says that Moscow is one of the 3 cities globally where the growth of temperature is the highest, on par with Calcutta and Tehran. So we are experiencing the climate change with our own skin here in Moscow. And not only here, but in Siberia and in Antarctica, the infrastructure there, the residences there are under threat because of the permafrost melting. I mean, wherever we look, we are constantly seeing these problems. That is why these global trends challenge master planners, architects, politicians. That is why I would like to say it's a very ambitious challenge to make Moscow a convenient city for life, accustomed for life. Now it's more accustomed for survival if we speak about climate change. Therefore, and by the way, I need to highlight that it's not only about climate change. Not only the climate change makes a difference. the city itself can make an impact on climate change, both positive and negative. So we need to be thinking about decarbonizing cities, in urban mobility, in urban construction. That is the way to mitigate climate change in the city. That is why I'm very happy to have this format today, to have this group of people, so that we could host a number of lectures and discuss specialized subjects and aspects of the mentioned process, described process. And once more, I would like to mention the fact that the lecture is hosted in the framework of the year of cooperation between Russia and Germany. This year gives us an opportunity to plan and host various events and gives us the platform to discuss subjects that matter, in our opinion. This is one of the events. This is one of the described events. And this event resonates a lot personally with me. So I hope that all of us will have a fruitful conversation. Thank you. Angelina, thank you for having me. Miriam, thank you. Miriam, thank you. Thank you for your intro. And thank you for outlining the significance of climate agenda for cities, including Russian cities. And I would like to welcome Lisa Gürt, who represents Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Moscow.
Also not in Russian, because I think that would be too big of a challenge now. Yeah, I'm also very happy to open this lecture on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And thanks to all the partners who organized this lecture series, which is, I think, really a great project. And also especially thanks to Miriam, who played a big role in connecting all those partners, and also did like a very good introduction now on why we are supporting this project on the perspective of cities and climate. We from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation here in Russia have various projects in the area of ecology, climate, but also in the area of urban development. And I wanted to, because Miriam now said like a lot of words on why climate is very important in this aspect, I wanted to focus a bit more on why we as Friedrich Ebert Foundation are actually focusing also on urban planning, because I think for us, we think that this cities and how cities are designed, that's really shaping our political and societal life every day. And also, as I think the introduction, which is written on the landing page of the project, makes it very, very clear. And that is why we are talking about today about climate in cities, about also more in the next ones about, for example, energy efficiency, and also one about environmental participation. That is, of course, because the city of the future has to be climate friendly, or better, like climate neutral, but also it has to be an inclusive city. Because I think that space, or urban space in general, is not something that is just given externally, but it's really a constructed space that we can change, or that we are constantly changing in social processes. And in this respect, I think that spatial and urban planning is a deeply political process, and that is why we are actually supporting such lecture series among other projects, because that actively determines how and with whom we interact, and how we feel living in a city, and how we feel, for example, if living in a city is safe, or if living in a city is, for example, also safe for minorities or for women, and whether the cities we live in are actually adapted to the climate that we live in, and to the future that we face in the challenge of climate change. And yeah, so I think that's the main points I actually wanted to say. And also my voice, I feel my voice is like kind of at the end of my abilities right now. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hear the rest of the lecture.
Спасибо. Спасибо большое, Лиза.
Lisa, thank you. Now I would like to hand over the floor to the director of Marsh School, Nikita Tokarev. Please, Nikita. Yes, Angelina, thank you. I'm very happy to welcome all of you. The participants and the guests, we see more people connecting, more and more people connecting. Great. I would like to also thank Friedrich Ebert Foundation and the Embassy of Germany for their support. I would like to highlight a few traits of this project. These traits are especially precious to me. First of all, this is the international project because we understand the climate is changing everywhere, not only in Russia, Germany, Switzerland, or India. We're all equally dependent on the happening changes. Therefore, I'm very happy to be speaking about climate change beyond borders, beyond national borders. The second important point is that all of this project is based on a dialogue. This is the dialogue of two schools. We're very happy to our cooperation with Bauhaus, with the outstanding School of Architecture and Design. Which really laid the foundation for modern architectural school, modern architecture, about 100 years ago. So we're hosting an international dialogue, which I already mentioned. And Miriam talked about this year of cultural cooperation between Germany and Russia. Our meetings will also be based on the principle of dialogue. When we invite two presenters, two speakers, an international one and a Russian one. We may have, for example, an architect and a researcher, so that they would have a conversation looking from two different standpoints and discussing this colossal problem that is so evident to all of us. I mean, climate change and the way climate affects the city. And third point, since I am an architect, I am a practicing architect, and we will have many speakers who are architects. Therefore, it's very important for me to understand whether the architecture can actually pivot these problems, and to which degree architecture is the cause for the problems that we are discussing. In terms of the storytelling, kind of in terms of the plot, it's probably the most important question. What is the measure of our responsibility as professionals, as architects, for how we are facing the climate change, how we are greeting the climate change? Of course, we cannot be responsible for every cubic meter of CO2 that's being emitted into the atmosphere, but the contribution of buildings and cities into the climate change is indisputable, and it's big. So for the upcoming 10 years, for example, if we speak about any architectural project, I believe that the major question is, what's the carbon footprint of your building? How much energy does it consume? How much energy does it produce? These questions will be even more important than beauty, aesthetics, price, functionality, etc. And I truly hope that our discussions will at least draw out certain approaches to tackle this global task. Thanks, Angelina. You can probably introduce Daniela as the representative of Bauhaus. Yes, Nikita, thank you. Thank you for this very thoughtful conclusion to the intro. Thank you for pointing out the importance of the problem. I really loved, I mean, it really resonated with me, the expression that you used, that maybe in a few years, the major traits of the buildings will be not the traits that have been so important for centuries, and not even aesthetic beauty. And there are very important cultural shifts that are happening today, and we will reflect that in our discussion. I would like to hand over the floor to our partner from Bauhaus in Weimar, Daniela Zupan. She has done a lot to prepare this program. We are very joyful to work with her. Daniela has visited Moscow a number of times, and she actually speaks Russian pretty well. And she's our frequent guest and a close friend. Daniela, please. Angelina, thank you, and good evening. Good evening, dear colleagues.
Maybe I just come back to the first word by Miriam, who reflected about Moscow and how much pressure you feel like in Moscow, the heating, etc. So I'm saying hello from the small city of Weimar, very green city. Hello from Bauhaus University, but nevertheless, like these questions haunt us here. There's nothing that we discuss more intensively at the moment at Bauhaus University than how to react and how to conquer the climate crisis, how we have to change our education, how we can like change how we prepare future architects and urbanists, urban planners, but also researchers to produce like a more socially and environmentally just future. And therefore, I was immediately in when you contacted me from Moscow, and I'm very glad that we achieved to organize this lecture. I am very much looking forward to today's dialogue and also to the upcoming meetings. And I want to say especially big thanks to Angelina and Nikita and to the whole organizing team in Moscow who made all these technical issues and everything working. So thank you already a lot. And now I give the floor back to you, Angelina.
Спасибо большое, Даниэла. Ну что, друзья.
Daniela, thank you. So, dear friends, let's begin. I will soon hand over the floor to our current guests. It's not that they will be presenting some overly deep and thoughtful lectures. Otherwise, they will be sharing their remarks and thoughts about the events happening. Because our cycle of discussions is called A Changing City in a Changing Climate. And it's not only that the climate is changing, social context is changing as well. We are changing the standard of what is acceptable in urban development. Our expectations from urban spaces are changing. Our expectations for what we see when we go out into the street are changing. So we will be speaking about all of these trends and changes. And before I hand over the floor to our today's guests, I would like to draw your attention to a very important document that, together with Daniela, Nikita, and all of the co-hosts, we've written. This is our manifesto. Let me post the link to our manifesto. It will be accessible on the chat to everybody, and it describes our understanding of the issues, why we're doing what we're doing, why we believe that this is so important, and what are the changes that we want to observe both in Germany and in Russia and in Switzerland and in other countries. So, dear friends, let me introduce our distinguished guests opening the discussion today. Our friends, if I may. On behalf of Switzerland, we have Axel Schubert. He's the urbanist teacher of the University of Applicable Sciences in Basel in Switzerland and climate activist. Axel, good evening.
Good evening. Nice to meet you all, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's great. Thank you.
Спасибо. И Мария.
Thank you so much. And Maria Falalieva, a consultant in climate policies and urban development, expert of the UN project, the leader of the Eco Project Foundation, and the author of the book called The New City for the New Climate. This is the pioneering book in Russia that generalizes accumulated knowledge of the cities, of the countries, in terms of how cities are tied to climate, in terms of how urban development is connected to climate. Maria, good evening. Maria, your microphone. Yes, can you hear me? Yes, good evening. I would like to greet all of the hosts and participants. Angelina, thank you for such a detailed intro of everything that we're going to be talking about. I would like to highlight that, like Nikita said, since we plan to host a dialogue between the international expert and Russian expert, I would like to clarify, I am not a purely Russian expert. I actually come from Belarus, but I work as an international expert. And this year, I believe it was my first experience of working with Russian cities. That is why it's a great pleasure to be here. And I believe that the cities of our region, I mean Eastern Europe, have a lot in common. And that is probably good that we not only have here Russian experts, but experts from the regions. That is why I believe we should really kind of maintain not only sub-region, well, not only general dialogue, but also regional dialogue. So I would like to hand over the screen to Axel. Axel, please, your presentation, your speech.
Thanks. Thanks again for all the nice words and invitation. I just want to begin to share my screen. Yeah, and the one part I didn't translate, it's Klimaverantwortung jetzt. I'm talking as a climate activist. I'm in different movements, but that webpage, Klimaverantwortung jetzt, it does mean take responsible for climate now. That's my private webpage where I put on some critique and stuff like that. Yeah, I want to talk about climate crisis, system change, and some insights in Switzerland's climate movement. It's heterogeneous, but also there are some shared points and demands, and that's maybe good to know for you. What are those points? So I want to start with climate. I want to talk about what's about climate heating today. I'm talking often about climate stuff and talking about that and the urgency beyond that's really important to have as a context for our shared acting. Then I want to share those demands of the climate movement. I want to give some examples from the climate movement here in Switzerland, and finally focus on system change beyond sustainability. What could system change implicate and mean for us? And that's important for us as planners. Which futures could be promising? Is there hope? Okay, let's begin. I'm doing all that pretty quickly because many things are well known. But anyhow, we do know, for example, in July it was very cold in Europe, but not so in Russia, not so in Africa. Not so in Canada. Cities were burning. Cities were flooding away in Germany. And if you're looking back the last 2-3 years, every month, every year, there were records, world records, Europe records. Just to think about, we often say, hey, it got to come close, then we will change. We had so many chances to change, but I don't know whether we really do. It's very clear human climate heating is human induced. Even more, if there wouldn't be cooling effects, it would be even hotter today. The global climate we are talking about, if you're talking about 1.5 degrees and so on, it's not the local climate that's important. The heating above land is about twice as high as in the global average. And that's why, for example, in Switzerland, it's already above 2 degrees Celsius. And we also know that climate change and the CO2 concentration in the last 800,000 years, it's very parallel. And we are now much higher than we have ever been. This slide is pretty well known. Which is not so well known is this one here, that the rate of change is so it never was like it is not right now. Yeah, those are the absolute values. That's the dynamic beyond, and this is never seen in human history. It's also important to know weather and climate are two things. We have a sensitivity for weather differences. If it's 5 degrees hotter, it's heat stress. But if a 5-degree change in climate, it's the difference between ice age and today. It's something very different, and climate is a statistical value. We don't have a sensitivity for climate change, just for the weather. And it's just not heating and weather extremes. It's also that our ecosystems are stressed. The burned forest, for example, in the middle row, that's in Switzerland 2 years ago. The species which are migrating and so on, that's important for food security and health reasons and so on. But maybe even more important, or the most important, is that we are fighting climate wars, that people may not stay there where they live because there are droughts and they got to leave. And also in Switzerland, people often think, hey, Switzerland, that's not so vulnerable. The second picture, you see 2 years ago, helicopters were flying water in the Alps. And the Alps that's the castle of rainfall in Europe a bit, but the cows, they haven't had enough water. Dead fishes, tons of dead fishes in the Rhine River. It was too hot. The Rhine was too hot. And so we know from climate research, the temperature scale or temperature development on a gradual scale, if we limit to 1.5 degrees, it's much more better than to 2 degrees. With 1.5 degrees, we already have in 2300 on the right side of the slide, water tide rise about 2 meters. 2 meters. So 1.5 degrees often talked about, it's a goal to achieve it. No, it's a catastrophe already. And never, it's a limit, but not a goal. Never talk about 1.5 degree goal. It's a catastrophe. It's not something acceptable, actually. That's on the gradual scale, but we also know in societies we have tipping points, abrupt changes, shifting baselines in societies, and in ecosystems, those are called tipping points. We have 15 climate systems which could change rapidly and switch in a different stage. I won't get into details. There's much research about that. And the researchers, they say, if around 2 degrees climate heating, those different climate tipping points, they can come together and they can make a global tipping point with consequences which are horrible. It would throw us in a hothouse Earth on a long run. 10, 20, 50, 100,000 years, I don't know, a sea rise from 60 meters. But a very abrupt and fast development in climate change. We may not reach those plus 2 degrees. Those climate tipping points are too risky to bet against. And that's written in Nature. It's not just any magazine, it's written in Nature that we are facing an existential threat to civilization. Right now, we are in a planetary emergency because now we can change something. And they say, in other words, warming must be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's exactly what the climate movement is fighting for. Okay. So what are the demands of the climate movement in Switzerland? I got to give some more context of the politics, climate politics, because that's the background against the climate movement is fighting. Actually. So what are those politics? Worldwide, the heating projections until end of century, they are about 2.4 or 2.9 degrees with the current policies. That's from this year. So the ruling politics worldwide, they're just gambling away our future. The power of movement is changing things, but still far too slow. What does that mean, 1.5 degrees? We know CO2 in the atmosphere is very long-lasting. That means we have a finite budget of CO2. And that means net zero is needed to stop heating. If you look on those graphs in the middle up, if the emissions stay the same, the heating will go on. Yeah, I hope you see my mouse. Maybe if the emissions stay the same, the heating will go on. If the emissions up, if the emissions are falling, the temperature will go up until the moment where the emissions rise to or are zero. We got to reach that point of net zero emissions. How much time do we have for that? How big is that budget? If you look in the last ICCP report from August, that global budget is about 400 gigatons for 2/3 of probability of achievement. You can ask her 2/3, what's 2/3? Would you go in an airplane which for 33% falls from the sky? 2/3 is not so sure, huh? But let's take that value. We are emitting about 40 gigatons per year. That means right now we have 350, 250, something like that. And there are many uncertainties, but let's just think about those two values. If you do go on like we do today, we have 8 more years globally. And if you say, okay, we can do something great, and we are reducing emissions linear, we have time globally until 2037, something in the 30s. So we have a really, really very big problem of urgency. It's not just we have a climate crisis, but if you want to fight against it, we have a problem of huge urgency. But we also have a very huge problem of injustice, because the world is affected very differently. Just these weeks in Kenya, there are about more than 2 million people. They are at risk of starvation, like it's written here. And the injustice is also that just the richest 10% of the world are responsible for 50% of all consumption emissions. And 50%, the poorest 50% of the world, are just responsible for 10% of the emissions. It's a huge, huge problem. And there are also there's research that the rich part of the world, the increase in consumption is in the richest part of the world, the highest increase in the last 10 years. So we also have a severe problem of injustice. While looking to Switzerland, what is the tendency? In the last 20 years, actually, the emissions are staying the same. And Switzerland, as a very rich country, we have the world record in importing emissions from other countries. So we have about 14 tons. And with our pension funds, we have additional 6 tons abroad. So that's about 20 tons, plus the effects of Switzerland as a financial hub and financial center. That's about 20 times as high as the inland emissions. So in the statistics, normally you see Switzerland right here in the middle, and we are very good and brave and rich and good democracy, and everything is fine. But with those effective consumption emissions, we are right here. Or in that graphic, you see that's United States, Canada, Belgium, Australia, Switzerland. And I also marked Germany and Russia. Okay, so net zero, that's necessary. What does it mean? Politics are talking often about 2050, the Swiss government, IPCC too. The climate movement is demanding 2030 here in Switzerland. If you're looking in the assessment report, the last one, just the blue scenario could limit global heating to below 1.5 degrees at the end of the century. We will reach 1.5 degrees already in the early 30s. So definitely the blue emission scenario is required. And that's also the blue one. It said, yeah, 2055 global, we got to be on net zero. Why so late? Well, I will come to that later, but what's clear, we got to reduce now immediately emissions drastically. And that's also written in the IPCC report. Because we have, in that scenario, the emissions would be net zero, not just not in the 30s, but 55. That means we have an overshoot in the mid-term of century. We have 1.6 degrees, maybe even 2. We don't know that. It's a very risky thing because if we have 2 and we are triggering those tipping points, we cannot change them anymore. So yeah. But the crucial point, that scenario with late net zero implies that we do have net emissions technologies in a high scale. We got to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, and not just a bit, but really much. And the IPCC says it's risky, not proved on big scale. It's conflictual because it's very intense to have forests, for example, and so on. And you can have a forest to burn it, or you have a forest to produce that what we do eat, that what we need for construction and so on. It's also to the BECCS to produce CO2 while let growing forests grow, and to burn them and to take the CO2 out of the burning gases. That's risky too, because when there are droughts, when there are fires, when there are thunderstorms and so on, the forests can go. However, okay, we do clearly say net zero in 2050 in Switzerland violates also the principles of the Paris Agreement, because there's a principle of climate justice involved in the Paris Agreement, the common but differentiated responsibilities. We gotta be faster as rich, technically rich and developed, highly developed country with big emissions in our past. Okay, so it's a bit almost too simple, but we got to actually be fast in reducing emissions. We got to demand for 2030, and the rest which will be there, we got to compensate. But we may not do that scenario on the right to prolong the emissions, to have a big loan and mortgage to get them out. Finally, net zero 2050 or 2030, that makes a really big difference. That's the strategy of the Swiss government. They want to make 2050 with that path. They are topping that CO2 budget at least by the factor of 3. I did that calculation. You can find the links on my webpage there. So discussing 2050, or in Germany 2045 or whatever, it's the new conservative mainstream of urgency deniers. You can also say it's the new conservative mainstream of those who really don't take care of climate justice. What are the demands, finally? The demands in Switzerland from a movement which is, it's a colorful movement, but they have they came together as Rise Up for Change. That's different movements are trying to put up shared values, and those demands are: we got to acknowledge the climate emergency. We got to break our routines. We got to listen to science. We got to actually do. We have to have climate roundtables in governments every week, like it was done with Corona, but with the climate crisis, which is so much bigger, there's hardly anything about that. We got to demand net zero 2030. Extinction Rebellion even demands 25. We got to take climate justice as principle. It would be too complex to focus on that now, but there are many aspects of climate justice. Also, and that's maybe one of the important aspects, to make climate politics which leave no one behind, which are in a social way adaptable. And then we got here, especially in Switzerland, include the finance sector. If all that won't help, the climate movement demands a system change. I will talk to system change in 1 minute. The movement is broad, and what is maybe even more important, that beyond Rise Up for Change, for example, there are many other movements too. There are coalitions. There's much solidarity in movements, and that's important. There's the Frauenstreik, the women's strike here in Switzerland. There are parties, there are environmental movements, churches, and so on. That's addressing Switzerland as a finance center. The UBS and Credit Suisse, two of the main banks here, they're investing more and more billions of dollars each year, more than after Paris, each year more, which does not make any sense. And the movement is organized in climate camps. They come together. They make the manifestations, Corona conform, with cultural stuff and so on. You do know about that. That was a protest action 2 years ago in Basel and Zurich, for example. People who were participating from Germany, they may not enter Switzerland for 2 years now. Yeah. And then it's about the finance center, how I said. There you see on the lower left, Credit Suisse, UBS, and that transparent, I made it 2 years ago. I made it for the Pride in Zurich, for the gay parade, because, and that's important, I think movements got to they got to join. It's not about intersectionality, but movements got to be solidarity to each other. And the Pride in Zurich, the main sponsors, that's UBS and Credit Suisse. Yeah. So there's one part of a movement, the gay movement, which they haven't understood crucial points of development.
Axel, I'm so sorry. You didn't say what the bank is investing in. You just said they are investing, and you didn't tell the story. Can you clarify it, please? It was sorry.
It's about Finanzflüsse. It's very complex. They make it possible that other companies spend their money in, for example, the North Dakota access pipeline and so on. Big infrastructure projects for exploring more oil. But there are many reports on that topic. But that's the reason why the banks in Switzerland are really one of the most important the climate movement addresses those banks.
Thank you. Understood. Thank you.
Also, the Swiss National Bank, for example. And rules are made up, for example, in Davos at the World Economic Forum. So we had a great walk to Davos. I also took that transparent. It was just great to have it on this movements. It's so fun because there are so many. People are really. It's great to be there. Those 3 days, they have been the best in the whole year. You feel the cooperation, you feel the solidarity, you help each other. It was so great to do that together. There's also another point, the cement industry here in Switzerland, Holcim, for example, those were a couple months ago. Also many protests against them. And that is sure related to our building industry. The CO2 emissions from the cement production, they're about 8% of the world emissions of CO2. Okay, now another movement, that's the Climate Justice Initiative in Basel. I was one of 4 who had invented that, and now we're getting a bigger movement with a committee, very broadly from culture, environment, like you see it, churches, planning science, and so on. There's an English translation on the webpage, and we are demanding to write in our constitution here in Basel, the canton of Basel city, that there's written 2030 net zero and climate justice principle and so on. And we reach that our initiative is shared by many parties, initiatives, and so on. And we hope to get something changed in the city. To do all that, it's not just to gain, if people may vote for that, but to build up a movement locally, to bring the movement in the neighborhoods. That's what we are doing right now, to have the idea not to make one action and the next action and again the next action, but to make an action which engrows the movement, enlarges the movement. Okay, I'll have some more. That's also from the climate movement, the climate action plan in Switzerland. It's a 380 pages document with 140 actions. What could be done to get to net zero in 2030? It's also in English, you can find it. And the first measure is to stop building completely. There are some things which are allowed, but actually it's a moratorium on building. Okay, maybe that's a good point to start to say some words about system change and sustainability. We know sustainability to merge together 3 dimensions. Is that the deal we need? What kind of deal do we need? A sustainable one, and that's that model where 3 dimensions are coming together to get holistically integrated. Or shouldn't we rather have another focus on those 3 dimensions? That is the system how it works. We have the economy, which determines actually all that what happens in society and environment. And it got to be other way around. We have an finite ecology, and the society is responsible to deal with that what we can put in there and we can take out of there. And the economy is the principle of efficient allocation of finite goods. So forget about the mainstream model. It's about a cultural usurpation to bring those ways of how societies work, to bring them in a different order. So it's about an embedded economy which has a serving character. It's not about greening. That's not a goal itself. It's about justice. It's about a climate red New Deal. It's about system change. And how could this be? What is the hope we could have? We got to think of that future world as not just a greener one, but as a different and better one. A just world, just transition, with the solidarity, with all those values. And the moment where we are in society worldwide right now, it's actually pretty sad, and we are not always very happy in that situation. And if we have in mind that we can, in our societies, that we can change things also in a better way, in a more happy way to live, to have more time, to be maybe less stressed like today, maybe that's necessary to find a way out of that crisis. Maybe that's necessary to find our motivation to really change things profoundly and not just to greening our techniques. So many thanks, and I'm glad to have some good discussion later on.
Axel, thank you. That's been very vivid. I would say even passionate presentation. In many ways, you delivered science agenda, political agenda, social agenda as well, talking about the essence of climate change, what it means for various regions, why people go to demonstrations and protests fighting for climate, what's happening in Switzerland, what is climate justice and how it's applicable to the global system of transformation that the world needs in general and cities need in particular. Maria, now I would like to hand over the screen to you so that you would be able to transfer it closer to the level of the cities and to the soil of our region. What would you say? Adgirina, thank you. This is what I wanted to do, transfer all of this to a more local level, more level of the cities of our region. But I would like to highlight that the things that Axel is talking about need us to understand two things. First, all of the climate data and reports that Axel has shown, they testify, IPCC reports testify that on the one hand, it's only possible to reduce emissions if we work together. And there are no countries that are more responsible or less responsible, because we often hear that some countries emit less, some countries consume more. First of all, point A, we can only reduce emissions together. And the second important message is that in any case, if our effort to cut emissions will be successful, we will need to adapt anyway. Unfortunately, probably we are following the trajectory when we are unsuccessful in cutting emissions. But if good things happen, and in the upcoming 7 or 8 years that we've got, we'll be able to get to the plus 1.2, 1.5 degrees. In any case, we will have to adapt to the climate change. What does that mean for every single one of us and for the cities of our region? This means that in the upcoming decades, we will be living in new circumstances, like all of the cities everywhere in the world. And the conclusion that Nikita mentioned in the intro, that all of the city planners will need to figure out the new reality somehow. The third idea, the third conclusion about Axel's presentation is that very often in the countries of post-Soviet space, where climate agenda is very underdeveloped, we imagine climate action as climate activism. But we need to understand that climate activism is, of course, good and important. Yes, it's a part of social movement. But even, I mean, every professional today in the city needs to be a climate activist. You don't need to go to demonstrations for that. It has to be individual, professional climate activism, meaning every urban professional, specifically urban planning, urban construction, architecture, urban improvement, water amelioration, greenery, parking, etc. If you do anything in the city like that, you need to be aware that you're doing this in new climate conditions, and you must take those conditions into account in what you do. As it's written in our manifesto, we all must see the development of our cities in our climate activities via the new climate optics. How can we get that optics, specifically in the countries where that optics is sorely lacking and where people mostly don't see the importance of it? So, first of all, in order to connect these two streams, which is lower emissions and climate adaptation, the city, the country need to have a climate plan. The climate plan, like Axel has shown us for Switzerland, it must be for every city, every big city. And in reality, many major cities have been developing those plans. They have those plans. And Many cities in the Eastern Europe are also coming up with that sort of plans. And Russia is no exception. Eventually, I would like our today's discussion to revolve around the question, how we can make it happen so that every Russian city would have this sort of document around which we could be building some sort of activities. Because in reality of the post-Soviet space, we're facing only the beginning, the preliminary step of activities. Why? Well, first of all, historically, if we speak about the impact of climate change onto Eastern Europe, the climate agenda has arrived to our region with a delay. It's a long overdue subject of public discourse. So, to make cities develop climate plans, in many countries, that's fostered by legislation. For example, why the major cities globally develop climate plans? Not a single conservative urban administrator or urban developer would be doing those climate programs. They have enough things on their table. So they are fostered by either national legislation, for example, EU legislation, or national legislation of EU countries, which makes cities develop that sort of plans. Or the city is facing obvious risks, like London, which historically has been under threat of flooding. The city clearly sees that it needs to do something and therefore comes up with a climate plan. Many cities today in the world are working based on the principle of prestige, because if the city has climate plan, that means that the city has some sort of vision for future development. Usually climate plan is not only about climate, it's also about the development of the city, about the comfortable city. Therefore, it's a sign for investors and residents, highly qualified residents, citizens. That shows to the citizens that the city knows what it's doing and the life will be comfortable and decent. So this three stimuli, legislation, risks, and prestige, they are making uneven impact on the post-Soviet space. If we talk about legislation, correct me if I'm wrong, by the way, there's this national plan of adaptation. And according to that national plan, the cities and regions must develop some local strategies. And as far as I know, that must be done during the upcoming few years. But there's a big issue there because they are obliged to do this, but there's no methodology. Still, that's some sort of stimuli. I mean, urban administrations in Russian Federation will eventually have to develop some sort of programs regulating adaptation to climate change and climate in the city. In addition, there's another risk factor, especially in the Siberia and the northern Siberia and Arctica in Russia. That is a good conversation point. That is a good point to start a conversation, to make cities do something. The cities in Eastern Europe, nevertheless, in my experience, are facing certain borders. They don't quite see why. They need to develop a climate plan. They're so over encumbered by bureaucracy that taking on another task of that scale is a bit too much for them. And maybe specifically problem in Belarus, which is present probably in other cities. Sometimes urban administration is just anxious about responsibility. They think that if they develop land, they will have to be responsible for those 10 points in the 10 points plan. Eventually, they would have to be responsible and report on that plan. So it's better not to write something that you would not be able to be responsible for. And climate plan is a strategic document of a new type. Our cities are not accustomed to that yet in the Eastern Europe. So the situation is not rainbows and unicorns, but bearing in mind those negative moments, I should say that those moments are not impossible to overcome. And looking at my accumulated experience over the recent years, it's curious how to observe how social groups in different cities look for the entry points. I mean, what's the entry point into this problematic in a particular country? Sometimes it's very unique. And that entry point is a starting point to develop a plan for climate action and get the charge of climate in the city in terms of reduction of emission and adaptation. And there's a number of such points for many countries of our region, especially Ukraine and Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, and partially Kazakhstan. That entry point is the so-called Mayors Agreement. There's European Mayors Agreement. That is the union of cities that take on certain responsibilities to reduce emissions and adaptation lately. And there are cities and regions that join the agreement, and their first obligation is to develop the climate plan, climate action plan. So the agreement of mayors assumes that the developing countries are getting certain benefits. For example, if there is the city administration that developed the climate action plan, then in the future they will get the grants for the implementation of that plan. And by all means, that is a stimuli for urban administration. So we should not wishfully think that urban administrations are developing climate plans because they're just so gentle people, such gentle people. They are getting financial stimuli for that. But still, this is a way to push urban administration, saying that if you join the mayor's agreement, if you develop a climate plan, then you might get additional money for that. That is a good stimuli. In Russia, as far as I know, only 3 cities have joined that agreement: Moscow, Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, and Rostov-on-Don. I don't know why only those. I would like to hear the opinion of my colleagues if there's an opportunity for that. If Russian cities have not used this opportunity, I think they should. And many cities and many mayors also think that international exchange is a really good thing. For example, there are sister cities often. And for example, if there's a social group in the city that is curious about the climate agenda, they may see what is happening in a sister city. Usually that is a reason for positive feedback from urban administration, and maybe through international cooperation it's possible to promote this subject. In addition, there is another group of entry points, meaning showing how climate can bring additional benefits to solve existing problems of urban management. And a classical example here is greenery and green infrastructure, because water and greenery in the city is a subject that is clear to everybody in the city. Administration, citizens. If you ask an average citizen and ask, Ivan, how about fight for the climate? He says, nah, let's do it tomorrow. But if you go to the same Ivan and saying, Ivan, let's have more water and green in the city, he say, yes, hands down in favor. So if that will also help with the emissions and adaptation, that's a different story. There's this special English term called mainstreaming, meaning making something mainstream. We still need to mainstream climate agenda in Russia and in Eastern Europe as well. And that mainstreaming can lead to curious unions. For example, in the framework of the mayor's agreement, one of the niches, one of the entry points for many administrations is energy efficiency. Any urban administration, especially in the Eastern Europe, understands that energy efficiency is good. This is first and foremost not only the way to reduce emissions, it's the way to cut costs. Cutting costs and increasing comfort of the citizens. And if, in addition to that, we're cutting our emissions, that is just really good. And people react to that in a very positive way. Another thing that happened a month before, in the end of August, we went together with Angelina to the conference on urban improvement in Russian cities. That happened in the end of August in the city of Nizhny Novgorod. And I see the new curious entry point in Russia, what we call urban improvement in Russia, amelioration of urban environment. Via these tools, we can actually improve the climate situation as well. Urban improvement, meaning building parks, making alleyways and streets more comfortable, not simply a park with benches. It's not about benches. It's about making a park that also helps the city to adapt to climate change and reduce emissions. So we're building a park in the city, explaining to city administration that if you do parks so and so and so, planting not just a lawn with beautiful benches, but certain kinds of trees, then this park will be consuming emissions. And if you're planning a park in a certain way, for example, setting their half-wide lawns on how they're doing in Novosibirsk, for example, the city of Novosibirsk, the park that is temporarily flooded throughout the year, that sort of urban improvement then can also make a positive impact on the climate change. And we can explain to urban administration, it's not just you guys build the park, you actually covered this and this and this points in your climate agenda that you need to develop next year. That is a way to work with the issue of climate change. And that is accessible to everybody. And that is particularly related to urban planners and developers. Because it always comes down to the plan of the development of the city. That could be called a master plan, a trendy term. But first and foremost, I believe that architects, urban planners, activists need to be aware and come together in certain groups and understand that this is a very complex issue. And we need to be searching approaches down many avenues in your particular city. And I would really love our discussion to revolve around these subjects, how we see the situation, and what kind of entry points we can find in our very own cities. That's what I wanted to say. Maria, thank you. Thank you for this very hands-on presentation, relying on your hands-on experience, both positive and negative, in the region of Eastern Europe. And thank you for the recommendations on how city activists and experts and city administrations can kind of entry the subject of climate agenda and how to move forward in that direction. We have a ton of questions, actually. I will be reading them gradually, some of them coming from the chat, some of them were sent to me personally. Axel, right away, this claim that we need to stop building anything at all was very disputive, obviously. One of our listeners is saying that it's quite impossible and unfair. So if we stop building, stop constructing, how would that be implemented in practice? Can you tell about that in more detail? How is it happening? How does it look like?
It doesn't look like at all, because we are on the wrong development path. Here in Basel, we want to build a new highway, for example. We are also, official politics are on a completely wrong development path. Also, that the climate agenda is already set, but to have a climate agenda does not mean to take seriously to be seriously about the climate urgency, because to have an agenda could mean, okay, we have 2050 and the markets will do it and the technique will do it and so on, and we consume a bit less, but we do have to have profound changes of our way to live together. And to say not to build anymore, put up different questions. In Basel, for example, and it's a demand for Switzerland, not for all regions in the world. In Basel, for example, in this city which is built, there did live 40 years ago about 40 1,000 people more than today. Today, those are 200,000. So it's a question of social organization. How could it be maybe possible?
Sorry, Axel. What are you saying about this population? Can you repeat it? It was not clear.
Today it's 200,000, and it was about 240,000 in the 70s, 60s, 70s.
You mean the population of the city? Overall population of the city, you're saying, or what?
Yeah, of the city. It's a small city. So people were moving out, and we did not tear buildings down. We built more. But that means we consume more space for living. And the question with a moratorium on building would be, how could we organize ourselves differently that in the existing buildings may live more people? Yeah, that would be a development without building. And we may not build any infrastructure, maybe for public transport. And we may put all the focus on retrofitting buildings and so on. That's the focus we got to have for the next generation. That's the idea behind that.
Thank you, Axel. Another comment to your presentation on this subject. And a link to what is happening in Russia. We were impressed by the idea that we stop building at all. And in Russia, we have this program of renovation, where they're going to demolish a few million of square meters and rebuild them. Also, we're going to build newer cities in Siberia. According to the news, those cities will also include the demolition of ecosystems. It's curious to think that the city will be fairly working on a climate agenda. That's a comment that we received. Another question to both Maria and Axel, but I will ask Maria probably to answer first. Maria, climate plan of which cities globally and maybe in Russia or Eastern Europe, Belarus, in your opinion, are well, thoroughly thought out, and we could take those programs as a benchmark? Are they, by the way, openly available, those plans? Well, that's my favorite and least favorite question at the same time, because they're often saying, give us the example, show us how this agenda should look like. I often give the same answer. And if you heard this answer, please do excuse me. I say this: I have seen climate plans of Chalusy in the region of Mogilov in Ukraine, or Belarus. It's 15 pages. New York has 500 pages. Which one is better? The point is that they exist. That is good. The plans may be different. A big mistake, not even a mistake, but misconception, wrong expectation, is that people find large-scale, detailed documents, believing that if they do something differently compared to those documents, they're doing something wrong. No. A good plan is a plan that justifies the risks for your city. A good plan is a plan that involves experts from your city. A good plan involves data about your city. A good plan consists a list of events, simple primary events that will quickly mitigate the risks. Again, still, what could you look at? I loved Plan of London, really. It's very interesting. Since they have been working on the subject for a long time, they have been applying curious methodology. They may be one of the only cities who did that. They have the so-called lines and scenarios. The plan has been so meticulously developed that, for example, if by 2030 it goes this way or that way, if the level, roughly speaking, of Thames is this amount of meters, we're doing this range of things. If the level of Thames is this high, we're doing this set of things. They have very clear if-then logic there. Less probable, more probable. So if you want to see a really detailed plan, go and look at London's plan. You can see New York plan. New York's climate adaptation is called resilient New York, which means the New York that will survive pretty much. So they are therefore showing that adaptation is only one of the elements of resilience. By the way, all of these documents are accessible to public mostly, and often translated. Even if the document is coming from a non-English country, they are translated into English. Google it up or write me. In my book called The New City for the New Climate, I have some references. I'm not advertising my book. I'm just saying that one of the objectives of the book was to put together this sort of agendas and translate certain climate agendas into the climate action plans into the Russian language. And there is a number of links to a lot of documents which I often use. So do take a look at the book. As for Russian language documents, even if you Google Moscow adaptation plan, it's not perfect, but that's a good starting point and a good example for a Russian language plan. A good plan, I would say. It's not hard to find documents, but don't think that if you're not as meticulous as London, you're wasting your time. No. And the first question that was asked to Axel, I want to answer that. About, I mean, I understand that this issue of about not building at all is shocking, but that is a brilliant illustration of the fact that adaptation, climate action is very much dependent on local conditions. Something that is good for a small city in Switzerland is completely unapplicable for a large city in Siberia. I mean, as Axel said, we need to go beyond the paradigm of building wider, taller, etc. I mean, it's a radical approach. We have been accustomed to the paradigm of building more, but it still highlights the point that if somewhere in Switzerland we need to build less, maybe in Siberia we just need to build better or differently, not necessarily less or none, maybe differently or better or in a different way. Thank you, Maria. Axel, so could you please answer to the question of which climate plans of which cities you believe are quite decent? Which one would you recommend?
No one. No, it's if you read those documents, some are great if you're reading them. And especially in the last years, there are developments. Take Paris. They want to have average maximum speed of 30 kilometers per hour in all the city. Just the highways are a bit faster. And they want to remove 70,000 parking lots and so on. Take Barcelona with the super blocks. I think there are some policies in each city or many cities which are good, but you really have to grab it there and here and there and look carefully what is adaptable for a city. It's not one solution which fits all. But take those things like in Barcelona, the decisions to really change the neighborhoods, to take out the cars. People didn't like that at the beginning when it was said to do that. And now they're happy. Take the same in Ghent, for example. They had a radical change in the way how they organized their traffic flow. And the mayor who proposed that he was asked to be killed. And now people like that. With the rise of the cycling rate of 17% in 2 or 3 years. Yeah, and there could be really good changes, but we do look carefully. And I think the best programs are those who also involve the people, not only the experts, but also the people. To bring and to build up a consciousness of the urgency of the change which is required, And without that, no government and no major can change really things. The consciousness of the people got to be there. Or yeah. For example, one where Basel is not so bad too. In Basel, since maybe 4 years, 3-4 years, if you are renovating your building or building a new one, anyhow, you may not use gas or oil for the heating system. It's forbidden. It is forbidden. There is no fossil heating anymore in Basel in new buildings or renovated buildings, and it works. Whole Switzerland is copying that environment law from Basel now. There are technically other solutions, and we got to push them.
I would even disagree that there are no good plans. There are many good plans. It's just application is not always good. I mean, there's a huge gap between legislation and implementation. The plans sound good. And as Miriam said, it's a political question. Miriam said in the beginning, it's a political issue. That's why climate is politics. As it has been written, comments, there are plans for the development of new cities in Siberia, building new cities in Siberia. And I don't remember how it's been written. Obviously, they're going to be destroying the environment. And probably they will not be good climate plan. Yet again, it's a political issue. It's not about climate science. It's not about those who develop technologies. It's about politicians. It's about political system of a given region and about people's consciousness. Often turns out that there's a plan and it's hard to implement. And there's a question, and everybody's blaming climatologists, climate scientists. It's not them to blame. Maria, thank you. Next question. Also to Maria, from Dmitry, from the region of Tyumen. It's far in the east, the oil mining region. So he's asking, what actual recommendation, hands-on recommendation you would give for the CIS region? How can we change urban management, for example, in Russia? What should we start with? Dmitry, if I speak about this, will the police knock our door? I mean, seriously, I will be saying something revolting, I believe. I mean, we can say a lot about changing urban management so that urban administration would do something about the climate. If I had to mention one thing, I would like to touch the subject of engagement of people, engagement of experts. Climate, there's this English language notion about climate, a wicked problem. So climate change is a wicked problem. Climate is a wicked problem because, why do we call it a wicked problem? Because it ties a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of groups, scientists, mass media, politicians, people, ordinary citizens, and managing this sort of flows is not quite possible, but it's about engagement. It is only happening thanks to engagement. We cannot take a genius mayor who will do this. They don't have all of the knowledge because knowledge is very localized. I mean, only residents of a particular neighborhood know that, for example, they have like floods in this period of rains during a year. And there's a different neighborhood where it's not happening. So we need to listen to the residents of this particular neighborhood and get information from them. I understand that this is a very simplistic example, but equally, if we need to write a climate plan for the city, we need to engage specialists from different areas. And all of these things need to stitch together. And engaging different experts, different sites, hosting dialogues of different formats. That is a weak point in our administration, because often administrators see that as a threat, as a revolt, as a demonstration, as a scandal. Yes, it is happening more often than not, because both sides are responsible for failure of a dialogue, for failures of dialogue that are happening. But still, we need to understand that people in the administration are people, and we need to share positive cases, small projects like small parks. That's not only an item of urban improvement, but also an item of climate agenda for the city. These small projects are steps for the maintenance of a dialogue. Yes, we cannot only cope with we cannot only do it with small deeds, but still small projects is a way to go. Maria, thank you.
I'd like to add something there. It just can be an incremental change, but we may really consider if all cities of the world will change, that will not be enough and sufficient. We also got to tackle the national level, the state level, the international market system, and so on, because cities are embedded in all those processes. And that's why, for example, the Finance Center Switzerland is one of the biggest and important things for the climate movement here. So cities can do things to create locally different circumstances to have another all-day life and so on. But there are structural problems which got to be tackled on a different level too. And cities got to demand for that on their national level too. Because cities, they won't be strong enough to, if the climate change is not stopped quickly, cities cannot adopt. The change would be too strong.
Thank you. My next question arrived from Daniyar Usupov from St. Petersburg. He's an architect, and he is a panelist of our future discussion that is happening on October 25th, by the way. So here's what he's asking. He's asking, other examples when a climate plan for a city or municipality would include a chapter on measuring whether climate risks are important to the citizens and whether the citizens actually believe that climate change matters. And other climate plans that estimate the efficiency of climate events, taking into account the opinions of citizens, small businesses regarding the events that are being implemented. I will rephrase the question. I mean, I did rephrase the question to make it more simple. Yes. So briefly, are there examples where municipalities actually poll this sort of opinion, measuring whether the citizens actually are interested in the climate? And also whether cities are measuring the approval of certain climate events, for example, taking feedback from the population about what the city is doing in terms of climate agenda. The question is to whom? To both. To both. The question is to both. Well, I can say this. Approximately, that is always happening. Any plan that's been developed, if it's efficient, it includes some sort of polling of the population. And we've partially touched this issue, speaking about why this is important. This is an element of engagement and finding out what citizens think about the climate, whether they care at all. It needs to be the first step. Why? Of course, that's part of democracy, but the citizens also have certain resources, certain information And climate events are normally complex. Climate actions and activities are complex activities involving citizens, businesses, public administration. So without engaging businesses and citizens, you never get support. You will never make anything happen. In addition, there is, in every plan, there's also a part that describes kind of enlightening the population, teaching the citizens about the climate issues. I mean, you will never be established energy-saving mechanics or even separation of trash, sorting of garbage in a city unless you explain to people why that matters. Axel, what would you say?
Yeah, I think governors are afraid of the people, so they look carefully and they do feel carefully what they think people will vote for. So there's an indirect link between that, what is produced as policy, and the consciousness of the society. But in that deal, you can. That's the point where you have to be encouraged to bring something forward, and not just to make that what you assume could be accepted. But you got to design public consciousness, not in an ideological way, but just talk about science. Yes? Just make clear what huge problems we have and we got to face. And then we are more willingly to really look carefully what changes do make sense, what changes are appropriate. Because we do talk about so many things which are nice to have and good, but not appropriate to that crisis.
Thank you. Dear friends, we're almost running out of time, but we have 2 extra questions. So I suggest you answer those 2 questions. We're still getting questions, but just we have extended our time already. There are recommendations from climatologists to architects. What the architects have to take into account to make the neighborhood more ecological. What sort of recommendations could climate scientists give to architects? There are this sort of recommendations, and climate science, there's also construction and development climate science. That is a special branch. The recommendations on climate comfort of the residential blocks are widely available to architects and have been. Those recommendations are part of construction standards on a national level. However, contemporary architects need to understand that these recommendations are ever changing. The figures are changing. If previously there were certain standards on comfort of urban environment, those standards were calculated based on long-term data collection. But those long-term indicators are no longer valid. They have changed. There are maybe some other factors and technologies. Why am I saying this? Because this is not news. How do you make a city block that is comfortable in terms of climate? It's just the input data is different. Where do we get the data? Of course, today there are exciting programs to calculate the comfort in terms of climate, taking into account anything up to the age of trees and bushes and shrubbery. You just need to look for that data. I know that Russian colleagues today are following the idea. Yana mentioned this idea to translate certain books, collect the library of that sort of recommendations. We are lacking information in the Russian language, unfortunately, which is sad because at a certain point, Russian National Architecture School was really exploring that a lot. It's hard for me to give a set of recommendations, but regarding the list of recommendations, I recall this interesting article by architects from Finland. They have put together 10 commandments of a climate architect. Of course, it's generalistic, but it's worth taking a look for a start. So look for data. Look for data. It's there. It's there. It's a lot. There's a lot of it. Just look for it, adapt it, and talk to your colleagues. I know that there's this beautiful program called Architecture RF, Architects RF. It's a beautiful educational program. They need to deal with climate more. It's a big network. I think it's a way to go. Axel, just a second. You're sending the link to the project.
No, to another one.
Architects Net Zero 2030.
Yeah, that's a group here which was founded here in Basel. Architects which are demanding net zero by 2030. It's just in German, I think, but maybe for some of the students in Weimar, interesting. I think both can learn from each other, scientists from architects and other way around maybe too. We can learn from scientists. They are doing great stuff in modeling local temperature scenarios, and we got to consider them seriously to know about how to redesign also in surfaces, colors, and so on, shading. But actually, we do know very much about it, and it's like you said, Maria. It's about how to get the data and how to applicate and how to create a good design out of all that. It's, for example, take trees. We are demanding making cities greener, but if it's getting hotter and hotter, which tree do you take? We don't know yet. We really don't know yet. In Basel, we are making experiments with trees from the Mediterranean right now. Yeah. But I also think other way around. Architects or society and scientists can learn from architects. Not from all of them, but if we as architects and urban planners are getting seriously about that problem, we have the competences to imagine how futures and societies could look like. And I do encourage to do that. Not to say we have all solutions, but to envision how different futures could look like and to bring those proposals in a discussion in the society, to engage people in those processes, to bring up ways of how urban life could look like. And that's, I think, important. Architects should not do that alone. Also, if they want to get political, like all others, they got to get collective and they got to do stuff together to break with that idea of it's a concurrence. We got to bring up things together, and we are stronger if we as architects and associations bring things up together. And that's something which should be very encouraging for all students to think of that huge design demand we have to transform our societies. That's what you got to learn while studying.
Axel, thank you. A comment from Yana Mertsalova, Architecture RF program. They've just released, taught a group of students on the climate change. Yeah, but it's more of a general idea of for the community. And we should really foster this idea of putting together the library on the books and materials on making the city more green, but also more green so that we do something about climate change. Okay, next question. How do you persuade authoritarian governments that want to implement huge infrastructure projects, mega projects, to do something about climate change and develop green and water infrastructure? What do you do in the context of authoritarian system, political system? Honestly, I don't know. Specifically, being citizens of Belarus, although I don't know in Belarus. I know what's happening there. Complex development for climate change show, by the way, why authoritarian systems with certain advantages has other drawbacks in the end. Because authoritarian systems are not flexible, reacting to the most contemporary challenges. Speaking about authoritarian system, that's a big personal question. However, in any situation, there's a way to persuade administration. Even non-authoritarian administration in a democratic country is not willing to change, and that's understandable. Based on my experience, here's what I see. Pilot projects, small steps, they help the administration to see the benefit. Saying that if, for example, they work with different groups, environmental groups, there's nothing to be scared of that. On the other hand, it's very important to talk to administration in the language of risk, damage, and costs. Yes, somehow it's not easy to compute the cost of reduced emissions or climate adaptation, because it's even more complex. But it's possible. There's a curious example in the city of Minsk. They do have sort of a historic block in the center of the city that's very green. They wanted to make it more dense. City density is a whole other subject. And the citizens were fighting a lot against that. And one of the things that they did is that they actually ordered a research, one of a kind in Belarus, that computed the benefits from the fact that this greenery in the center of the city is consuming CO2 emission, etc. It's absorbing CO2 emission, etc. So what the citizens can do is that they can actually order this sort of research for their neighborhood. It's just important to show the benefits, the costs, etc. If there's a trend in Russia to understand that the city needs a climate plan in any way, shape, or form, it's been written in legislation now. I mean, the cities will come up with some sort of plans, maybe not the best plans, maybe good plans. Sometimes you just need to approach administration saying, guys, if you need to do this, let us help you. I know it sounds idealistic, but that may work as well. And it often works. Not to chide them saying, you are bad, your plan is not good. No, instead just approach and say, guys, there's this curious thing. And also, by the way, academia, universities can cooperate with city administration because universities are very strong in the cities of Russia. We have very high level of higher education. Universities are there and they should not be an island. So administration is an island, university is an island. They should work together. Yes, the universities are doing researches, studying hydrology, ecology. They could do it together with the urban administration. They don't need to go far. They can do it together with the city in the city. Thank you, Maria. Axel.
I actually cannot talk about those topics because we are lucky to live in a country with high democratic values, but that doesn't mean everything. I could encourage to go that path of cooperation and small paths and incremental change on the one hand. On the other hand, it got to also be always their subversive part to bring up consciousness in society. And there also universities got to make that move towards administrations, but also toward movements. And movements could be, they are internationally linked, and you got to make those relations more powerful and strengthen local movements. I think that's so important because finally, if also authoritarian administrations, if they see that 90% of the consciousness is somewhere else, it's easier for them to move, I think. And so I hope do encourage your movements too. Take care of them. All of them. All of them.
Last question. Hope for a brief answer. Many questions, as you may see. So, question from one of the members of the program, Architektor RF, Architects RF. A question about climate strategy. Not always the strategies are mandatory in Russian cities. In Russian reality, often climate strategies are formal documents, but assuming any actual steps, roadmap, or even financing. What are the things in other countries when there is climate agenda, climate strategy that's been written down? Who is responsible? Who finances that? Are there any ways to be responsible? Probably more question to Axel. I will answer after that.
Written plans are written plans. We have human rights, and there are written so many good stuff in there. And what's about human dignity 60 years after it was written? So a plan is a plan. And it also, if we are demanding our the people here of Basel to change our constitution, it's also just written in the constitution. And we know if it will be written in there, we got to bring it to life. We got to stay actively working on realizing things. So paper is just paper, and life and reality is much more. And it's about a fight. It's so simple. But a fight which got to cultivate cooperative elements in society, because our basis should not be one. And there where we are heading to should not be one which is based upon that fighting principles, but on the cooperative one. And that's a dilemma for movements to do this both at the same time.
Axel, thank you. I would personally like to say that there are many strategies, especially if the document is called strategy. It assumes more general view. Sometimes it's more of a claim. They need much more detail, further steps, sub-legislation, norms and regulations. And in Russian practice, even if there are clear goals like legislation and energy efficiency that is being discussed at the moment in the parliament, again, they adjust the goals. There is some financing that's been written down, then it's unavailable, etc. I mean, it's complicated, to put it briefly, but we live in a situation when there's urgency for change, and it's important to understand what legislation we have, what's the nature of that legislation, whether it's mandatory, how advanced it is. Even if you're an architect or urban designer, if you start dealing with the climate, again, as Maria said in the very beginning, it's important to understand what's the entry point? What's the entry point? What legislation we have at the moment, how you can use it, speaking about it. As for adaptation, there's nothing particularly strict there. We have this national plan, this national legislation that assumes plans for industries and regions, and only a few regions in Russia have been doing that. Probably they will do it in the last moment. The plan in Moscow that you mentioned, for example, it's called not a plan, but it's methodological recommendation for a plan. So it's very, very preliminary. Same thing in St. Petersburg. They have analyzed risks very well, but that's it. They have not integrated it. We'll see. That's why we're hosting these events and having these conversations. I would like to say a couple of things. There's a lot of misunderstanding, meaning that European system of policy making and decision making and Russian system are very different. And the European system, for European system, it's normal to, for example, adopt strategic plan and then develop sub-legislation. Look at the example of European Green Courts. In the end of 2019, in December, they adopted a document that is very brief and very declarative. And it took them 2 years after that to develop sub-legislation and policies. So we're often facing a situation that a Russian or Eastern European cities or Belarusian cities sees the plan of EU or France saying, this is too general, this is nothing, this is not mandatory. But you need to understand that first they normally develop more general document, then they develop a plan, and then as a part of the plan, they fund resources, write sub-legislations, norms, and regulation. And that's how it's possible to find the resources, because even the richest city is not able to find a ton of money for a generalistic plan. That's not just happening. It's not happening ever. Also, we have general plan. When we develop sub-norms, we actually are able to find the money and redistribute the budget. This is happening not at the level of a general plan. This is happening at the level of sub-legislation. That's why we need cooperation. As Angelina said, cooperation between lawyers, economists, and everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Axel. Dear friends, we're wrapping up our first conversation. I would like to thank all of the hosts for so much effort that they invested into our first conversation. We have planned a lot of events till the end of the year. You can find the schedule on the website of Marsh, and also we publish them on our social networks. Our upcoming discussion is happening on the 26th of October, also 7:30 Moscow time. You're seeing the information about the upcoming events on the screen. I would like to thank also the interpreter for helping us today. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for asking so many questions. I do believe that indeed it's been a very thorough conversation when we were speaking about the consequences of climate changes and the abilities to react or lack of reaction, about the will of the public, and about how we can help architects to start doing something about it. Please stay tuned. See you again. Bye. Thank you, Angelina. Many thanks to everybody.
Bye. Thank you.